so there may be plenty of trouble there. There's a base in Manta. There's a base in El Salvador, a new base going up, and there are a couple of others. And they don't tell us what they're for, but probably for planned military action. Colombia now has moved to first place in the world in receipt of American arms. That's aside from Israel and Egypt, a separate category, but it replaced Turkey in 1999, and it's going up again next year. And you usually learn a lot by watching the flow of arms, and it tells you where the atrocities are going to happen. And Ecuador is part of this. In Bolivia, for example, another country subjected to all of this, it was under martial law a couple of weeks ago. There was a big peasant uprising in Cochabamba, one large town in Bolivia, because following World Bank instructions, the government's been privatizing everything, following World Bank instructions. And those instructions require that people pay what are called user costs. Like you have to pay the actual cost of water, say. It can't be provided as a public good to people, like in any civilized society. But if you want to follow World Bank rules, health and water and all that kind of stuff have to have user costs. So they privatized the water company. That was sold to probably more or less given. There's claims that it was total corruption, which it probably was. Anyhow, it was transferred over to a Bechtel-based conglomerate. Bechtel's a San Francisco, London-based big conglomerate. And there were months of protest over this, and they finally ended up so extensive that the government had to declare martial law. And in fact, an interesting case. This happened right during the Washington protests, and the interaction between them turned out to be kind of important, maybe one of the most important things in the Washington protests. The focus on the IMF and World Bank, combined with the protests in Bolivia, allowed an international network of protests to develop, mostly through the internet, which was enough so that Bechtel backed out, and the Bolivian government backed off the privatization, at least for the time being. I'm sure they'll come back. In the background of this also happens to be coca eradication. Right at the same time, there's a big agricultural crisis in Bolivia, just like all through the Andes. Peasants have been forced to coca production, and now the coca is being destroyed, by chemical and biological warfare. And there's a huge protest of peasants around La Paz, the capital, about the same time, over the destruction of coca. I mean, they don't want to grow coca particularly. They're calling for alternative crops, support for alternative crop production. And the U.S. doesn't want to do that. I mean, we're perfectly happy to destroy, but not build. The Colombia plan, for example, includes nothing. The guerrillas in Colombia for years have been calling for some funding for creation of alternative crops, so the peasants aren't forced to grow poppy and coca to survive. And absolutely nothing. The new Colombia plan has, so far the United States altogether has provided $750,000 all told for alternative crops, which is nothing, and zero for the guerrilla-controlled areas, which are the ones that are under attack.
A couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, you gave a kind of lecture called Power to the People, where you addressed the role that activists played in shutting down the MAI talks. And I was just wondering if you could maybe address some of those strategies again for those of us who are, engaged in those.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have anything smart to say about strategies, just the usual things. But for example, this Bolivia case is a perfectly clear case. I mean, here's just right a couple of weeks ago, thanks to the protests in Washington, which sort of focused global attention on the World Bank and the IMF, Bolivian peasants and some activists, there's some North American activists there who can handle the internet and that sort of thing, which most Bolivian peasants can't, were able to organize international protests, amplified greatly by what was going on in Washington. And they were significant, like, New Zealand, for example. There were big protests at the Bolivian embassy, and police had to be called to protect the embassy and that sort of thing. The effect of that was, at least temporarily, to save the water system for poor people. It doesn't, power doesn't stop. They're going to try again. But that turned out to be an unanticipated beneficial consequence of the Washington protests. And these things tend to feed on each other. They, I think the word is synergy or something like that. They interact in ways which help each other. And I don't think there's any particular right tactic. I mean, whatever seems appropriate at the moment and where you are and so on. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could touch on what's now being lauded as the end game in the Middle East peace process.
Yeah. This is an interesting notion. The term peace process is another term of art. What the peace process refers to, what the term peace process refers to, is to the U.S. effort to prevent peace. That's literally true. I mean, for the last 30 years, the United States has been almost completely isolated in the world in trying to prevent the diplomatic settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Actually, this was from 1971 up till 1991. Every year, there was a vote at the United Nations General Assembly for a settlement of the conflict in terms of a very broad international consensus. Israeli withdrawal from the conquered territories and the Palestinian state in the liberated areas. That's been an international consensus for since certainly the mid-'70s, and it's just about everybody. The U.S. has blocked it at every turn. It vetoed it at the Security Council a couple of times. The votes at the General Assembly are like 150 to 2 and that sort of thing, year after year after year, because the U.S. simply does not. It's alone and not calling for Israeli withdrawal and not recognizing Palestinian rights. Well, that changed in 1991, and it changed for a very simple reason: the Gulf War. The U.S. One of the main purposes of the Gulf War was, George Bush put it rather simply. He said, "What we say goes," okay, especially in the Middle East, and we're going to show that by force. And the world got the message. Everybody backed off. The U.S. then instituted its own extreme rejectionist program at Madrid and then Oslo and then since. The program that's been instituted does not require Israel. It requires partial Israeli withdrawal as Israel and the United States decide. So that's in violation of the major diplomatic agreements like UN 242 and others. It's set up in such a way, thanks to folks like us, we pay the taxes and we pay for the Israeli development. It's set up, if you look at the map, in such a way that the Palestinian areas will be separated cantons, kind of unviable separated cantons. So in the Gaza Strip, there are several of them split by Israeli settlements, and same in the West Bank. So the major development in the West Bank is what's called Greater Jerusalem. But Greater Jerusalem, if you look at the map, extends to a couple of miles from Jericho. And since Israel's taken over the Jordan Valley, that essentially splits the West Bank into two. And there's a couple other splits. It's a Bantustan settlement. It's very similar to the homelands that were established in South Africa in the early 60s. In some ways worse, because South Africa was trying to get some international legitimacy. So therefore it subsidized the homelands, tried to make them look like, it called them states. They were run by black leaders. And they wanted to make them look kind of legitimate, so there was some subsidy. Israel doesn't have to worry about international legitimacy. It's got the United States behind it. So therefore it doesn't have to subsidize. In fact, it doesn't have to do anything. When I say Israel, it means the United States, because that's the source of their funding and power and everything else. So that's the peace process. The peace process is something comparable, roughly, to South African Bantustans back in the early 60s, imposed by force, because since the Gulf War, because the U.S. was able to ram through an extreme rejectionist program. One of the most dramatic examples of U.S. power in the modern period that I know of is that most of the world has accepted this. Not only has Europe accepted it, but even the third world, like say in India, they think that this is a peace process. I remember I was there a couple of years ago and talking to people about it and saying, look, you yourselves were strongly opposing this a couple of years ago. How can you call this a peace process? And they'd sort of forgot. They kind of remembered when you brought it to their attention. But what the U.S. imposes is so overwhelmingly powerful that most of the world accepts it, even if they'd rejected it. That's real power, kind of measured in the ideological level. You just insist on your own policy. You got enough force to ram it through. When you get it through, everybody accepts this as right and just. And the end game is just, finishing it up.
Rather for the trade bill with China,
yeah.
There was some clause that was added that would ensure monitors should be able to go into China and look at the factories, look at the conditions in China, saying, well, we've never looked at that before, we're not going to let it happen. What do you think about it?
It doesn't make any difference. I mean, NAFTA also has, in order to get NAFTA through, they had to put in provisions that, guaranteed labor, monitoring of labor rights and that sort of thing. But, it takes power behind. Why should they? I mean, they will, they would if there was popular pressure behind it. The popular pressure would include Chinese workers. Like they don't want to work in factories that are going to burn down and people die either. So yes, if there was joint action by the population of China and the population of the United States to improve working conditions, sure. In fact, that's exactly has been the position of, say, U.S. labor. It's continually denounced for being protectionist, this, that, and the other thing. But that's not been its position. Its position has been to call for compensatory funding or other devices to improve conditions in the third world countries so that when they enter into trade relations with us, workers in the rich countries don't suffer. In fact, the model that they often use is the European Union. It's not all that utopian. Before the European Union integrated its own South, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, the third world parts, essentially, of the European Union. Before they did that, they did a lot of funding, called compensatory funding, it's called, to sort of raise their levels and their working standards and so on to something within range of Northern European workers. So that then when the borders were freed up, it didn't mean that everybody had a race to the bottom. I mean, there's nothing these are really mild reformist programs, certainly within range. And that's been essentially the position of the labor movement. But the corporations, of course, don't want it. They want the rotten conditions. So what the U.S. government will do depends on internal struggles for power inside the United States. And of course, in China, it's a difficult situation. The government in China doesn't represent the population of China at all. I mean, the government of the United States, at least to some limited extent, is constrained by the population, but not in China. So here's another point that Robin Hannell has pointed out very well in an article in Z a couple of months ago and in other things. The real issue, I think he's right about this, in the China deal is what happens to the people of China. Now, it doesn't affect people in the United States that much to some extent, but it has a big effect on people in China, and they don't have any voice. I mean, they're not represented by their government. They're certainly not represented by our government. But that's the primary issue. And it's an issue that requires cross-border solidarity, which is not easy to work out, but not impossible either.
I don't know if you can consider this a strategy question, but I was wondering what you think of what Ralph Nader's been doing so far this year, and what the coverage of that has been like, and even if you'd rather not take a position on that.
No, I think perfectly happy to. I just don't take positions with any confidence. I'm happy to take positions at a very low confidence level.
Position on globalization is roughly similar to yours.
Yeah.
If there's anything you critique of him, or if you just think the whole idea of a progressive presidential candidate is inherently ludicrous.
No, I mean, I'm one of the I signed something or other that makes me an official supporter of the Nader campaign. Yeah, I think as long as he puts issues seriously on the agenda, yeah, that's good. I mean, I don't agree with him about everything, and why should two people agree on everything? But these are, a lot of room for discussion here. So, for example, I'm much more anti-corporate than he is, and I think the whole system is wrong in ways that he doesn't. But on the issues that he's discussing, I think by and large, I think he's right. And if those issues can be put on the agenda of discussion, if they can become visible, through a political campaign, it's okay. I mean, I don't know if it makes much difference. When it comes to the question of voting or not voting, which is another choice, it's a very delicate decision.